The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of the Lighting Controls Podcast. This week we have a fantastic guest, Michael Skurla. It's going to be a fantastic episode, and just want to take a moment to remind everyone that this episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's also financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. And if you're listening to this on getagriponlighting.com, you should check out lightingcontrolspodcast.com, where this will officially be hosted starting in the new year, and you won't be able to see this on Get a Grip anymore. But you should also check out that website anyways to see any updating news in the lighting controls world, and check out some interesting merch if you want to support the podcast. Thanks so much, and here's Michael. Welcome back, everyone, to the Lighting Controls Podcast, where we like to talk about lighting controls. We're your hosts, Webster Marsh and Ron Kuzma, and today we have an interesting guest, Michael Skurla. Is that the right pronunciation of your last name?
You nailed it.
Okay, cool. Well, Michael, thanks for joining us. Do you want to just give us a quick 1-2 on who you are and what you do, and maybe a little bit of your history?
Yeah, sure. So I'm with an organization named Radix IoT. We're an interesting anomaly because what we do is focus on all of the data that is everywhere in a building and pull it all together into useful packages so people can use it for things like analytics. It sounds very simple, but actually this conversation today will be great because what is one of those? A lighting system. The average building has about 13 of them, right? Not lighting systems, but different systems. And pulling all of that data into a central location allows you to actually go out and do more productive things with that data instead of having little silos everywhere. My background, it's interesting. I started in lighting controls. I actually started in theatrical lighting long time ago, which I always said probably technologically was like 10 years ahead of everyone else. Just no other lighting company looked. But then I was with Philips, now Signify, for many years, as well as Acuity, dealing in the emerging IoT space, which I'm sure we'll talk about quite a bit, and what it's done for both lighting and building systems as a whole. That's me.
Well, again, thank you for joining us. And, I think you're right. It is such a unique part of our industry that there are so many people who like to point the finger and say, no, you're doing the data. No, you're doing the data. And yet, who is doing the data in the end? And so knowing a company that's going to be able to be responsible for that data is critical right now when you're doing IoT or Internet of Things applications. Just so that our audience can understand a little bit more if they haven't really fully understood what IoT means, do you mind just giving us a little definition of what IoT refers to?
Yeah, the Internet of Things, and there's all types of prefixes that have jumped onto this as well. IIoT, XIoT. In the end, I probably have a different perception of what this is. We have been doing automation and controls for years, lighting, buildings, 20, 30, 40 years. In fact, things have been producing data since the early 80s. The problem is no one could access it. IoT is a contract. One of the worst jokes I give in presentations is probably, hey, I got some IoT in the trunk in the car. Anyone want to buy some? Awful, absolutely awful. No one should be going out and say, hey, I got some IoT to buy or sell. It's a contract, though. We have an emerging amount of devices, a proliferation of these devices of every shape and size. And there's been devices giving off data for years, but now they've gotten affordable. And where's this contract? Well, we have Ethernet. We have the TCP/IP stack that has sort of centralized everything. We still have a lot of bizarre protocols that are out there and niche protocols, particularly in the building space. But in the end, everything comes down to the common factor that it's going on to an Ethernet jack somewhere, and that data is hopping up, theoretically can be accessed from a computer through the TCP/IP stack. So what is IoT? It's a commonality between different systems that allows communication. That is all it is. And an area that I think gets really confusing is to say, great, there's the IoT data side, but then they're saying, what do you do with this? And that is
Mhm.
a totally different side of the equation, often different people, and probably should be different people in the end. So IoT, Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, it's all about a contract of connectivity.
So yeah, so I mean, basically, what it's encompassing is this interconnectivity between unrelated components or devices. And so, IoT may apply to an automated home, it may apply to an automated building, it may even just apply to your car, which has internet connected devices that have that data collection and automation in response. So ultimately, what you're saying is that the data that we're collecting has existed in some vein out there since the 80s, but it's more of, okay, what do you do when you have that data? How do you use that data to improve your life?
Exactly. Well, the data's been there, as I said, but what's it been used for? So let's look at the average building, right? You've got lighting systems, and there's been lighting systems, for a long, long time. But you also have HVAC, fire systems, elevators, air quality, plumbing, Wi-Fi. All of this is in buildings, and they've all been generating data, but they've all been siloed. So they go back and, at best, communicate with their own system. And honestly, there's still a lot of systems out there saying, well, then you fire up a separate laptop that happens to have the software that was last released 9 years ago. You hope that the employee is still there that got trained on that software. And then they theoretically can make changes, though generally they're petrified because they haven't touched it in 8 years. And lighting control is, sort of the big one. Last thing you want to do is turn off all the lights. So IoT on that side is saying, well, those systems still exist. There's HVAC is a big one. So building management systems. The return investment to replace a building management system is exceptionally low. No one is going to go and say, you know what? I'm going to go change out every device in my building and change my building management system today because the ROI on it is just decades. But what IoT allows is the idea to say, well, you've got a lighting system and you have that HVAC or BMS system. Let's take that data, pull it out, but instead of funneling it to a separate software package that's only being used for diagnostics for the BMS or to adjust the temperature, let's bring those two types of data together. Lighting and, we'll keep it simple, HVAC. And what can you do with that amount of data? And that's where I think we got stuck for a while. The last 10 years, especially, have been really interesting because the IoT architecture got away with us. It started getting slapped on every brochure and at every trade show. But the question is, well, what do I do with this? How does this impact my business? And there's a ton of examples. We'll certainly talk about those. But the hardest part was saying, how do I get it together into one thing? The building management system is talking BACnet. The lighting system, who knows? Maybe there's a BACnet bridge. And then you get involved in things like fire systems and all of that. And it's like, can they even communicate out? It could be to say that you're actually using analog triggers to get just basic information out of that. But there has to be a central location where someone can sift that, organize it, and then push it somewhere, because then you can use it for applications in the future. Outcome-based analytics, or as some firms have put it, prescriptive analytics that you can run on the whole lot of data instead of just for that little siloed trade.
So, I mean, I think you've hit on something that's a bit of a sore subject in our industry, especially when it comes to lighting controls, is that siloed element. And it's not that you're saying that IoT is the integration between these siloed systems, but what it is it's a central repository for this information, as well as I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the actual manipulation and management of that data, and potentially even the dissemination of that data so that it can be returned back to the systems, so that ultimately there is some kind of intercommunication. Now, if it's super simplistic and it's analog input output data, yeah, okay, fine, you're not going to be able to do really advanced stuff with that, but at the very least, because you have that data, you can now create some synthesis between the silos.
Yeah, you're getting at something that's really interesting. And I talked about that sort of the last 10 years, what we've done with IoT. And let's talk about lighting specifically. Obviously, that's what the podcast is about. But we'll talk about lighting and say, you've got all of this data that has been coming in. And a lot of the manufacturers, and I was a part of this, have always said, oh boy, if we start releasing this data to other systems, we're going to lose money. Or we want to have the money from both the collection and the analytics. The problem with that is lighting is a huge source of data, but without other data mixed in, it's not very useful. Excellent example. There is best way to look at this is to say there is a company in New York that's an analytics company, and they are looking at high-rise buildings. And their primary focus, however, is actually the boilers and chillers of the buildings. Now, we're talking about skyscrapers here. And their whole philosophy on that was to say, if we can change the timing of when those fire up in the morning and shut down by simply minutes, we can potentially save tens of thousands of dollars in each building a year for tenants. But the problem was, how do they get the right data to find out when to do that? And their answer was to say, well, we need to put motion sensors everywhere to find out when people are in the building, on every floor, in every room, and then we can perform analytics and calculations based on that to basically hedge, saying, well, there's only 10 people here compared to 1,000, and we can optimize this per day using those analytics over a year. Great, you add motion sensors. That seems like a huge waste of money, right? Because let's look at energy code for a minute. What's in that office building right now in every single room by code? A lighting system. Motion sensors. Here's what the problem lies. Lighting system is made to give data only to itself. So what do those motion sensors do? Even though they're considered networked controls, well, they go back to the lighting system. They control only the light in the room, and they're tied in logic to both the switch and the light in the room. It was never thought through that, well, maybe something else would just want to know occupied or unoccupied.
Yep.
The data is there, or the system is there, but the system's not giving off or being permissive enough to allow other utilities to use that really valuable information. It would have been a tremendous cost saving. Think of that. Even if you buy cheap motion sensors that are $20 a piece, you look at a 50-story high-rise building, putting them in there, wiring them. You can talk about wireless, but let's not even go there. And then maintaining them over time, unbelievable expense. But by the way, they did figure out how to do this with one lighting vendor, and I'm not going to expose any names here, but they figured out how to get that data. And there's some interesting case studies on this where they didn't talk about the lighting system, which I thought was really regrettable. However, the real estate firm, which is one of the largest ones, did put out some studies on this, saying they're able to save per building somewhere in the range of $20,000 to $30,000 a month.
Wow.
And this is all based on analytics that are derived from a lighting system. So one great example, did they call that IoT at all? No, because by the way, this was almost 9 years ago, but the concept is there. It's that contract. If it would have been easier and it would have been native, actually the lighting manufacturer could have sold that concept, that open connectivity, as a bonus. I'm just saying, great, we connect with all of these other things, and here are all the potentials. But as an industry, we've been very weak and HVAC, by the way, is BMS system, same thing, where they haven't thought outside of just their own trades. They've done an exceptional job lighting HVAC about optimizing their own little silos. But that has a cap. A building is a single pie, and everyone
And
has a
so
slice of that pie.
I'm curious, where do you think the crux of the matter is? Why do you think that we're still so siloed?
Well, you could look at it two ways, in my opinion. One, there probably hasn't been enough cross-pollination between the companies, and that could actually be M&A style acquisitions that have occurred. Lighting has remained a fairly complicated business to get in, and I say that with a lot of respect, because we can look at examples of what happened years ago. Juno Lighting was purchased by Schneider. And now we know Schneider is one of the largest electric companies in the world. Breakers, panels, Square D, just an amazing company. But Juno itself was a lighting company. And everyone thought, well, great, we'll just get involved in lighting. But lighting requires such a diversity because of the artistic aspect of the product that there is a limitless number of different facets of lighting fixtures because of the architectural expression and design. Not one manufacturer can do it all. And so just owning Juno was great. It worked in a small segment, but you couldn't say that you're going to go in and conquer the lighting industry. You'd have to start buying up a ton of other companies, which there are some big ones out there, right? But it's just one example of saying it's a very big business. Lighting is an interesting one because it's hard. There's a very high barrier of entry to be able to sell a whole project,
Right.
as one vendor.
Well, and I think that, that's a good point, especially something that we see a lot when it comes to projects or companies that overlap with IoT applications, in the sense that they will try to penetrate the lighting market and they will get bucked because they're just not meeting the expectations, or their installation is too great, or something's not meshing between their standard operation and how the lighting world operates. And so, I think that's a good point as to why we're still siloed in the lighting world. I think we're seeing the roots of potential coordination, at least with HVAC, like you brought up. We do see more and more that HVAC systems are sharing common devices with lighting control systems, but that's a sort of one example that exists out there. Everything else, there's still too much siloing going on to say that we are fully coordinated. But I'm curious, you go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Webster and I have talked about this a lot on various episodes, where there's still too much proprietary, right, information and systems between all the manufacturers. And that's one of the things that we keep talking about, that we'd really like to see change. Is we understand that, your software is still going to be proprietary to your system. We understand that, but there's no reason that data from motion sensors and things, that's the type of stuff that should be open source, that should be able to be shared, so that we don't have, like that example of the high rise that had to put in additional sensors, right? These are the types of things we're trying to change and we want to avoid, but the manufacturers need to be willing to play ball.
Well, and I'm curious,
and
Michael, what your perspective is. What specifically in our industry is causing that friction?
Well, that's a really interesting question. There is a legacy, and we have to look at lighting controls compared to fixtures. It is two sort of different worlds. I don't think it's not the manufacturer's fault for the most part. When you look at regular lighting controls, let's go back to just switches on the wall. the Decora switch, which originally, was then called Decorator, when the patent expired. I believe that's what happened. But everyone knows how to install those. Everyone knows how to put in a wall switch. Not everyone. I mean, like my mom isn't going out and installing wall switches, but the average electrician knows how to put these things in. They know how to wire them. They know how to do some fairly fancy stuff, deal with, 3-way, 4-way switches and control them back. It's an industry standard, even if it's unwritten, that can be done. White is always neutral. You get into the network side and there was no standard. And you look at this at all the layers up. There's something called the ISO stack in networking, down all the way to the electrical level, all the way up to the user application level. Electrical standards between network lighting systems, totally different. Some use Cat5, some use custom cable. Color coding, not standard. So an electrician looks at this and is baffled. They can read the instructions and put all that in. But that's only that side of it. Then once you get it all wired up, you actually have to make it work. And that usually involves a computer. There are some really neat systems now for smaller locations that don't. But because of this non-standard configurability and installability, it's been a real struggle. And you've seen the adoption of network systems be forced by regulatory reasons, not by desire. How many times have you heard of customers going in? And I remember when I was out of college, I was a commissioning agent, and loved, it was so cool, putting together network lighting systems and installing them and programming them. But you'd often have customers, you go back 2 or 3 years later, what had they done? Paid an electrician to pull out some of them to put in regular dimmers and switches because they were too complicated for a commoner to come in and use. So now that has changed, but you still, with network lighting systems, for the most part, are dealing with commissioning agents. You're dealing with money that's made off of commissioning agents. You're dealing with money of network lighting controls. You're dealing money that actually can be driven by proprietary architecture. So you follow this money chain, and is there a solid motive for standardization on that network controls? There is, from the bigger picture, going back to my previous discussion, as companies get purchased within this space or expand into other fields, they have absolutely no choice to expand out and either start bridging their technologies into other things or adapting and coming up with standards. I think one of the greatest examples is, and I'll give Acuity props on this, is when they purchased Distech and they had Enlight. And they made it, Distech is a very well-known BMS company. And then they have Enlight, which is a very well-known lighting control system. They immediately made them so they can work together. So all of a sudden you're seeing this bridging. Now it's in very large companies, right, of lighting and HVAC. And you can see where they're going with it. And you look at the technology and the software they're building in, and you see the analytics side of it starting to develop. And it's like, interesting move. Will this drive standardization? Well, it has in some way, because the building management systems that they're using are on Ethernet and the TCP/IP stack and have open APIs. So is it all there yet? Is it really that easy to install? Well, no, you're still at contractors and everything, but it's an interesting step.
Well, and the other thing is that, we're often seeing in building management or building automation systems protocols that are meant to be intermediaries to different systems, but not necessarily the direct control for those systems. And so to be able to program on, for instance, BACnet, it's not just, okay, I connect these devices and it's ready to go. It's a huge lift to do that. And so, with this merger between a BMS system and a lighting control system, we are seeing some synthesis, but at the same time, I don't think everybody who specifies that system is going to know, oh, I need somebody who's going to actually program the other half of this.
You're absolutely right. There's multiple programmers involved in this, right? And normally, let's say you have a building management system. That's typically Niagara that's in there. So you have to have a Niagara programmer, meaning you're using a Tritium Jace. Then you have a lighting system, and meaning you have to have someone to program the lighting system. Then the two have to, ironically, at some point, exchange enough information to be able to poke at each other to connect the pertinent data. But this is the problem. It's not that they won't, though it's very hard because usually you want to be on site together and test things together, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
All of these people we've talked about have absolutely no idea what the customer really wants in the end out of that integration.
Yes.
So you have technicians and field service people making the best choices they possibly can, imagining who may be the occupant of that building in 4 or 5 years. How horrible is that? And that's where there's a lot of disenfranchised people, from the specifier to the engineer to the field service agents to the poor manufacturer who's getting beat up because the system's not doing what they want it to do. They never knew. Really, interesting topic on that, and why these bridging of protocols it's a stopgap solution. There's very good reasons for it. A lot of it's legacy reasons, but it's got to stop at some point.
To get to the crux here, really, it seems as though the industry lack of synthesis, the fact that we're so siloed, may also be the result of the fact that we don't have direct communication from the owner. The owner doesn't really know what they want. They don't state what they want from these systems, and so we're just adding in a system that may not even be necessary in some cases. And so if we're layering this on top and just requiring additional fees to have 5 programmers programming a full BAS, and the owner's going, well, I didn't ask for this. What happened there? Why are we at that place where the owner doesn't even know what's going on in their building anymore?
Some of it has to do with the way that we do construction. And there's the owner and then the user, right? The owner and the tenant. You look at most high-rise buildings and commercial office, they don't know who's renting that space. But the systems aren't flexible enough to adapt to that. That's probably where I'm going with this. The topic that we're talking about right now, the Department of Energy, in the 2022 solid state lighting workshop, went into, particularly for network lighting controls. There was a segment on it, and actually I spoke at that, so I'm a little biased to it. But instead of talking about technology, we talked about, well, what's the problem here with the lighting industry as a whole to not be able to, what do we have to do? What steps do we have to take to introduce standardization? And one of the largest things was language. We are not speaking the same language. Now, certainly not speaking the same language with other industries. But the problem is, even in products, between lighting control systems, different languages. Goes back to everyone knows how to put in a Decora switch.
Yeah, that's a consistent thing that we run into with our conversations with people, is that there is no standardized lexicon. We don't have definitions that agree with each other from manufacturer to manufacturer, specifier to specifier, etc. And so I would agree with you. I think that is really one of the very first things that we as an industry need to do, is agree on what is X, what is the definition of X, and then we can move forward.
Just even take the word commissioning agent, right? You could ask 10 different people what commissioning agent means to them, and they're all going to give you something different, right? That's just the way it is right now.
Yeah, I came out of theatrical lighting, as I said, and this was a long time ago. Worked for Electronic Theater Controls. Awesome company, by the way. And the word channel in the theatrical industry on a lighting console is a very well-known, solid and defined thing within theatrical lighting. When I moved into commercial lighting, it was like, whoa, this is not at all. And then by manufacturer, totally different what that concept is. So
well, and we're also theater people here. And just for people who are not theater people, channel refers to, in theater, a reference within the software of the console. It's not actually the physical address of anything. It's just a way of organizing so that all of your front light can be channel 1 through 10 or something like that. But associated with that channel is the actual physical address. What's either the dimmer or the fixture itself if it's LED. And that address is the unique identifier for that component. And so we will do what's known as patching, and we talked about this in a previous conversation with David Butler. But basically, you are connecting the two and saying, okay, channel 1 is address 349. But in the architectural world, you're right. We don't use the term address. We use channel to refer to address in the architectural
And this
world.
is where I said I think theater technology, particularly in controls, sort of was way ahead of the game. And it isn't just about technology. It was they had a terminology that they laid out. We don't have that in commercial lighting controls. We have what the manufacturer has chosen to give us with some names. And there is some improvement, right? BACnet, the concept, there are some hardened terms within BACnet and that certainly help us, though. Can you say BACnet is a great control protocol for lighting? It's a great bridge protocol for lighting, but it certainly was made with other purposes. And by the way, BACnet SC is a fantastic improvement. I hope that some manufacturers adapt to it and add it as time goes on. Well, but yeah, you nailed it.
Well, I'm curious, there are BMS protocols out there that do try to take the place of these proprietary protocols on networks or even DALI, such as KNX. And, KNX has wide sweeping success in certain areas in Europe, but in the US, it's just starting and maybe we'll see sweeping adoption for it. But right now, it's in the same ballpark as DALI or other protocols out there where it's fighting against 0 to 10.
Yeah, and why is it fighting against 0 to 10? Back to the Decora dimmer. Contractor knows how to put it in. It's easy. It's a couple of wires with wire nuts. I think you're right. KNX is very successful in Europe, supported quite a bit by Siemens. And it really has, though it's available in the US, you haven't seen much of a bridge at all over to that. Same with DALI. DALI certainly, there was a price hurdle to DALI for the longest time. And then you also had to have a commissioning agent. So how do you mix all of that into saying, well, is this worthwhile for me? Is that upgrade path really worth it?
So working our way back from this, I mean, we spent a huge amount of time kind of looking at the lighting control systems and our industry, but coming back to your role in all of this, it sounds as though, at least from a 10,000 foot perspective on our industry, you're coming in and saying, okay, you have all of this disparate data. We're here to help you connect and collate that data rather than, coming in and doing what other manufacturers or groups may do and say, you need to fix your industry and here's how you're going to fix it. You're coming in and saying your industry exists as it is. It's fine. But here's a solution that you could use.
Exactly. I talked about the rip and replace is just not affordable. There is no ROI generally in rip and replace. So we looked at it from a totally different perspective to say, well, great, you've got all these different trades and then you have all these devices that are getting added. How can you pull this in and rationalize this into something that makes sense? And not replace things. Our company and companies like ours aren't going in and saying, we want to really control the temperature in every room and figure out what it should be. No, companies like Carrier and everything have done that for years and they're really good at it. But we want to scrape all of that data out and then offer it to analytics companies or ourselves or customers themselves and say, you know the most about your business. Let's use that for something purposeful. and we also took that a step further. We actually focus a little bit differently because we're involved in multi-site applications where we really excel 50, 100, 10,000 sites. That's our sweet spot. But it's still the same philosophy. The idea is when you build buildings, even with your best of intention, you're not going to have the same equipment in every building. You're going to have a different air conditioner. Even if you say, I'm going to buy from one manufacturer, that thermostat will be revved one model, and it will speak differently. It may still be BACnet, but I guarantee, or Modbus, and the registers will be different. So how do you say, I've got 50 air conditioners. They're all different, some different manufacturers, but I want to know the runtime of all of them without having to be really intelligent, without having to map that and do all of that on your own. That's where we sit. We like to sit on top of this and say, great, we'll just start capturing this and we can organize this into a way that makes sense, that you can then harvest this data for now, so real time, or in the future for historical analysis, preventative maintenance, things like that. And we also offer toolings to do that. I'm not here to give a sales pitch at all. So,
Sure.
but it is the
Well,
premise of an IoT platform.
I'm curious what the hardware and software of this is, because coming from the specifier's perspective, I'm thinking, okay, how do I document this so that it's implemented in my project?
Yeah, this is an interesting one because from a specifier's perspective, it's a software play, not a hardware play. Again, let everyone else have the pie. They can have the whole pie. There's a air conditioning, heating, lighting. But on top, typically there is a single piece of hardware that's an aggregator. And it's sitting there connected to ideally as much stuff that's on TCP/IP as it can, but it also can sit down there and talk to more serial devices if it needs to. But on that device, which is just a computer, it takes all of that information, figures out what's relevant, organizes it into a secure tunnel, and then pushes it to the cloud. The cloud is where everything lives and all the analytics really occur. However, there's a premise here that you want to put a device at what, I'm going to go into data center terms now, so bear with me, but there's some good things to learn from this. The edge. There's the concept of the edge. The edge, think of that as a building. The cloud is all, up in a virtual storage and virtual machines. Then there's something called the far edge. And the far edge are devices, but it could also be that BMS system or lighting system, speaking something entirely proprietary. That's okay. As long as it has a gateway out to Ethernet or a known protocol, you get it to the edge device, sometimes referred to as a broker, that then speaks to all of these things to gather that information and then pushes it up to the cloud by any means necessary. And that's an interesting one. And I say by any means necessary because the whole idea of that edge aggregator is that if it vanished, if it got stepped on, if it got whatever, all of the subsystems keep working. The far edge keeps functioning. It also makes it so it's highly tolerant to loss of communication, which in the US, and I'm talking about commercial buildings, isn't such a big deal. But when you look at other applications outside of just commercial buildings, connectivity can be complicated and difficult and can only come at certain times of day. So that's why that edge device sits there, gathers the information it needs, finds pertinent, and then can push it out to the cloud. All the magic, however, happens in the cloud. And that is where the idea behind it is that a customer could build whatever they want off of that through easy tooling, or more importantly, it's an API that allows other analytics companies to feed off that information for lots of different purposes. And it's not just energy savings. That's the bridge you turn over. And this is why you have a lot of companies in lighting doing very smart, calculated moves on lighting. to say, well, what can we do besides illuminate stuff? Because it's pretty important. And where we got involved with geospatial analytics, indoor location services, because that is where data from lighting can be very important. And what I love about lighting as a vehicle for all of this is that lighting is always there. Lighting is often spaced at very uniform and geographic positions, except for specials. And it's moving to the path where it always has power. That's the other thing. So theoretically, a light fixture is an awesome thing to have, because you could put not only sensors and everything in there, but other technology, because it has power. And not everything in the ceiling has power without running more and more and more wire. So I totally accept that the world is going wireless. I have bought into this. If you guys have been in lighting controls for a long time, and I think I've seen wireless come and go 5 times, I think, since the early 2000s. It's not going anywhere now. It's here to stay on the control side, but the magic is you got to power a light somehow. So you have electricity. Those are why these moves are being made, and the data becomes important within the fixture, and that impacts drivers as well.
Right. But I mean, it's very similar to, at least we're talking interior, but for exterior applications, it's a similar situation where the light poles are becoming the central hubs for everything as well, because you need to power the lights. And so you have Wi-Fi and security cameras and all that are being integrated. So it makes sense that interior would follow that. And so the lighting system really does become the central focal point for everything to at least agree, okay, we're going to put a sensor here, or maybe even integrate other components. I've seen light fixtures where you've integrated security cameras or other unrelated systems. So, to your point, it is a great option for this synthesis. And so from your position, all you're doing is providing a little extra component to the system, and then a cloud service that is taking that data and using it as needed. But I'm curious, because it's cloud based, I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to go, whoa, security concerns, and have the red lights flashing. So I'm curious, from your stance when it comes to cybersecurity, what the concern or safeguards there are.
There's a couple, and again, I'm not here to sell us, but I'm telling you how the industry is handling this. That edge device, that edge broker, the thing that's getting the data, is vitally important to any IoT infrastructure. I was recently, there's a really neat organization called the IoT Security Foundation based in London. And they are one of the only ones trying to set up at least guidelines for manufacturers as a whole around IoT. This isn't just a lighting problem, by the way. IoT devices as a whole, it's the Wild West in some respects. Security is a huge concern because you have the cats are already out of the bag, and they've had litters of kittens, and they've learned how to clone themselves. There's billions of these devices out there already, and so we're retrospectively looking at security. Having, back to your question, having that edge device out there allows all of these other edge, far edge devices, whether they be IoT or building systems, to have a safeguard, a keeper, that's looking at all of this data and then encrypting it, sending it up through a single tunnel to the cloud. Is that a perfect scenario? No, because security itself is never 100% for anyone, any industry, and any person. One of the greatest phrases is, right now, the whole industry is moving from the idea of prevent, which is what we've done for years, your virus scanner, prevent. Well, when you're looking at there's 1,600 new breaches a month, 1,600 new VCEs a month, which are potential flaws in software, and you then look at how that exponentially grows, you can't keep up with that. And with this many IoT devices out there already, how are you going to go back and retrofit a camera you bought for $39 off of eBay that never had a firmware update? You don't even know who made it.
Right.
But it's a huge security flaw because that itself can be the problem. Having an edge device out there that's goal is not only to protect, but also be able to recover when something happens and be updatable is a huge step in security. So these type of systems are actually a leap in security, not another hole. They're stopping what's already out there. Great statistic is no matter what company you work for, if you are in a building, if we ever worked in offices again, right? There are 3 IoT devices that are there as your counterparts. You didn't bring them in, but there's a 3-to-1 ratio in a building. That's stunning. So you have 100 employees. There's 300 just IoT devices. That doesn't include phones, computers, laptops, tablets. It's other crap. And by the way, some of the most promiscuous security devices are 2 things that are in offices the heaviest: cameras and printers. Are massively insecure devices by nature. In fact, there's one in Europe where a company found that all of their cameras were actually mining crypto for several months, and they didn't know it, which is stunning. But hence the reasoning why this is, and it's also a different philosophy. Going back to your, this is a software service because you are really dealing in software. I mentioned that hardware broker or that device out there, that aggregator, can be a computing device, down to something as small as a Raspberry Pi up to several servers.
Just for our listeners, a Raspberry Pi is a tiny computer. We're not talking about the pastry.
Pastries are good, though.
My wife made that mistake a long time ago when a friend of ours said, "I brought a Raspberry Pi," and she said, "Oh, great! I'll get some plates." And he said, "No. This
That's amazing."
But at any rate, yeah. So I mean, from your stance, the device we're talking about is not necessarily a device that you would provide. It would just be, you would say, we need X number of specs met for this device to function, and everything else will take care of the data once it enters the internet, essentially. But it almost sounds like this device, for a very simplistic metaphor, I know there's so much nuance going on that varies this, but if you have a home router that has an integral firewall and everything goes through that to your house, you've at least created some kind of safeguard buffer between the internet and what's on your network in your house. And that's kind of what this device is doing.
Yeah. Now it's, yes, tons of nuance, right? Because we're talking about commercial to residential. But You're absolutely correct. It's very, very similar to that concept. There are a couple of important holes, though. One is, on the commercial side, you're never going to get, right now in residential, you buy into an ecosystem. Right? You have Alexa into your house. By the way, I'm totally non-committal. I've got Alexa, I've got Google Home floating around, and then I've got Apple devices, so Siri, totally non-committal. But you usually buy into one of them. And that's, in the commercial world, that's just not going to happen. You need to be able to connect to all types of things. And that's where these become a little more complicated. To go back to one statement that you made, that it's just a device, we are trying to bridge IT into the facility world. If you remember, for many, many years, commissioning agents and manufacturers said, whoa, run a different network for your lighting system, or run a different network. So you had all these mini networks running, and the concept was cool, but how does the concept break? One patch cable. And all of a sudden you can bridge a network into the business network. So most companies have started to say, yeah, that was probably a pretty bad recommendation. The right recommendation is to say, let's involve IT actually in the building. Because a facility manager is not an IT expert, too. They're not going to update switches. They're not going to, look for a crossover cable that accidentally got injected into a rack that happened to have multiple switches in it. IT is good at that. So use their infrastructure. And that's where we say, yeah, we have some boxes that we sell, honestly. We'll put the software on it, but that's not where we make money. We make money on software. We would rather say, let's talk to your IT organization who clearly already has security around this. Let's give them that software and say, let's put this on something that you feel meets the standards you need with your security professionality around it. Of us. So you've got double layers here where it's maintainable over time. It'll definitely get updated. All the infrastructure is updated.
So on that topic,
seems to be the preferred path.
When it comes to siloing, IT and lighting are probably the most siloed from each other right now.
Totally.
Sometimes you can't even get IT people to sit at the table with you because they say, no, keep it off our system. We don't even want to acknowledge it exists. And so do you have any advice for having that conversation?
Yeah, I do. That is, I remember when I was a commissioning person and I would say, awesome, perfect, great, I can get on with my job. I'll build a separate network and it'll just be there. No one will care. It's the wrong advice. The right way to handle that is, it does depend on if there is a specifier or a distributor involved, is to say, we're putting a lighting system, a network lighting system into this building. You are going to get significant benefits out of this because it can be on your business network and it offers operational savings, and anyone should have a good story behind what they're saying there. But the most important thing is that the people in your company that know how to secure networks can maintain this over time. And they should be brought in. There is more acceptance on that than there used to be. But I realize it is a different conversation because it also takes a distributor or a dealer to understand IT technology and have those conversations to a much deeper level than they're used to.
Yep. Yeah.
And
as a
really
dealer,
hard.
that's a big thing for us, right? So as a dealer and integrator, that is a conversation that we have on a very regular basis, right? We're constantly going in saying we want to bring IT in, and it is a tough conversation to start. They are very reluctant, but not even from a connectivity standpoint. A lot of times we start talking to them about cost saving standpoint. Like, IT can put us on a separate VLAN.
Bingo.
I'm now not installing a separate network. Why are we spending thousands and thousands of dollars on fiber and more switches when you already have a core stack that I can use? And that helps a lot with the purse strings.
You're creating that connectivity already, right? You're bringing it together. That's exactly what the conversation has to be. One of the greatest phrases that IoT Security Foundation is, everyone says we need to hire more infosec or professionals, security professionals for how many? No, that's actually, and they said that's absolutely wrong. We need to hire more people within the silos that want to learn about security and be a part of the security equation. That is not something that generally is happening. It's changing, and it's changing for the wrong reasons. It's changing because of breaches. One of the most well-known, and this is documented, breaches was several years ago. I can't remember the year at the moment. Anyone, you ever heard of Stuxnet? Either of you?
No.
Okay, so Stuxnet was a worm that was created by a government organization, apparently, and it was made to target very specifically nuclear enrichment centrifuges. And regrettably, it was made to actually sit on a Siemens S7 controller, which is a PLC, a SCADA system. Very well known, exceptional piece of hardware. And the problem with Stuxnet was it got out. It didn't just target, like every other thing like that. It wound up not just targeting specific metrics of saying it needs like 48 centrifuges and this and this and this. No, it wound up popping up in France and popping up in the US. And like, it was like, whoops, got out. You can research Stuxnet, fascinating one. But here's the really interesting thing about it. Siemens, their answer to this problem was exactly what it should have been. Make sure your firmware is updated. Don't use default passwords, and turn off protocols you're not using. Now, doesn't this make a ton of sense? This could have happened to anything that's out there. How many things do you know of that are still sitting with default passwords? It's utterly frightening. So when you talk about security, it's a really interesting problem, because most security breaches are not because of technology breaches at this point. They are because of people not updating, not following instructions, responding to phishing emails, that clearly are fishy.
Yes.
And that's where the hole happens. Sorry, I know I sort of drifted back to security, but it's such an important topic around this, where manufacturers should really go to.
We're going to have a guest on in the future who's actually part of a cybersecurity company. So we'll hopefully dive greater into this. But, you're right. It's a huge topic. And, there's a term that I like to use that I've heard from other people, which is good security hygiene. And that's what you're referring to, is making sure that just like you wash your hands after, handling messy, gross stuff, you want to make sure that you are keeping your network clean, that your passwords are secure, that your firmware is up to date, that make sure that you have good security hygiene to maintain that.
A lot of IT teams need to do a better job about conveying that to all of the users in the staff, right? So not to pick on my wife, but she's a teacher and she doesn't understand why can't she just bring a printer in and put it on the network, and why it won't work. And then she brings her printer in anyway because she doesn't listen, and sets it up to the wireless, and now other people are printing to it and she's got it connected. I said, do you not understand the security risks that you are bringing in to this school's network? And luckily enough, they made her remove it, because I told her to, and she didn't want to listen to me. But the school found out, and they made her remove it. So, but people, they don't understand, because the IT teams, unfortunately, don't do a good enough job about really explaining to all of the users what these security concerns are, and helping to teach the general public.
It's a problem, and it's all about education. It's all about education. I think the manufacturers are doing the best they can. One of the in Europe, there is a new proposed standard, and if I had my documents up, I could say exactly what it was. But for IoT devices, the UK has done an amazing job. They're sort of way ahead in a lot of ways on this. But they're introducing legislation for, it's really 3 basic goals. Every manufacturer has to tell a customer, first, they can't have default passwords. We went through that. 2, they need to tell you when there is an update. And the last one is they need to tell you how long they're going to produce updates. So think of your fridge in your house, right? I don't know. I would love to say fridges last a lot longer than 10 years. Somehow I was buying a lot of fridges through COVID. But you look at these smart fridges and you're like, okay, that connects to the internet. Well, how long is Samsung going to be making software updates to that to keep up with what threats are actually out there? You're right. I've got quite a bit of infrastructure in my house to hopefully guard against that, including firewalls and a router and everything. But you look at saying a lot of people probably don't have that. So is my fridge going to be secure for 4 years, 8 years? It should outlive the warranty, because I certainly expect the fridge to last longer than a year and be secure and not all of a sudden be a gateway into my home. We don't have that yet. California is introducing some interesting new legislation that at least made it on consumer products that you no longer have default passwords. But it really hasn't totally made it to other areas yet.
All right, so we're almost out of time. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think we've gotten to a really good place here with what the conversation really is. Because I mean, when it comes to IoT, there's so many variables and so much going on, and like you've said, so many definitions being utilized. So I just want to summarize what we've talked about here as best as I can. But basically, I mean, when we're talking about IoT, we're not talking actually about the hardware. We're talking about the software. We're talking about the data analytics of the systems. And so when it comes to IoT, IoT has been technically around for a long time. It's just that we haven't had a way to tap into that data that's well known or consistent. And so, having a company that can come in and take that data that exists in your building, instead of coming in and saying, we need to replace all of your devices, but rather we can take what you have right now and create a dashboard and information based on that for you, is actually a huge ad service to the life of a building. And especially because now we're seeing existing buildings needing to be revamped in some way to accommodate new initiatives like charging electrical vehicles. So
Mhm.
I would say that this is definitely something that owners should be thinking about as it comes to their existing infrastructure, or even new infrastructure that just, they have the way that lighting controls especially are right now. It's completely siloed in a lot of cases. And so you can kind of come in and help integrate everything together and keep it at least smooth when it comes to that data.
Absolutely. I will leave you with one great example, and this is I worked with a company that they owned restaurants, New Mexico, about 100 different restaurants. And they had 7 of them that had unbelievably high utility bills. And they were able to slowly whittle that down to say, it's definitely the HVAC, the air conditioners, the compressors are just running all the time. They wound up at 3 of the sites replacing them. Energy bill didn't change.
Hmm.
Now, interesting, and I'll tell you what the answer was in a minute, but this could have been resolved by something that was actually tapping into all of their trades and pulling the data together. So HVAC, lighting, security, that's it. That's all you really needed. If those would have been talking together and would have been able to give a representation of what each of these buildings was doing on aggregate, they would have noticed the back door was being propped open on those 7 locations all the time. Why? The manager smoked. So the back door was left open. And what was the air conditioner doing, by the way, with the thermostat that was right next to that door? Running all day in 100-degree heat.
Yep.
But if you would have had a single dashboard, instead of having a separate thing, no one ever looked at the security stuff until there was a problem at a store, some issue where they needed to look at it. And it certainly had nothing to do with HVAC or lighting. So these engineers kept looking at this going, we don't know. Start replacing stuff and let's hope for the best. We'll find it. It was a back door. Anyway, I always love that example of why
It's a great example, and thank you for sharing.
It is a good one.
But Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I think it was a really great conversation, and maybe we'll have you back on in the future to talk more about this as it evolves.
I would love to. This is absolutely fantastic. Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap for that episode. Want to thank Michael again for joining us this week. It's been a fantastic conversation. And just once again, would like to remind everyone that this episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's also financially supported by NAILD, the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. Again, if you're listening to this on getagriponlighting.com, you should check out lightingcontrolspodcast.com, which is the official site for this podcast. Check it out for any episodes that you haven't seen yet, or news in the industry, and also potentially some merch if you want to support the podcast. Thanks so much, and thank you, Michael.